We saw in the last video that even though consumption is a bigger part of GDP than investment, it actually declined less and contributed less to GDP shrinkage than did investment. And one of the reasons for that is that households in general like to smooth their consumption as much as possible. And so the idea here is that in good times, consumers will uh, save, and then in bad times they will use that savings or they will borrow if necessary. So if we think about this just not in terms of shocks, right, but just in terms of the life cycle, we could say that, all right, well, if you start work over here, then that's a period where your income is going to be lower, so you're more likely to borrow. You might buy a house, right? So you'll be borrowing against your house. You might buy cars. You might have student loans. All of that is borrowing. And then when you get a higher income, you start paying off that debt and accumulate your savings, your retirement savings, right? So people are saving in a 401k or other type of retirement plan. And then when you retire and your income goes down again, you're able to keep your consumption more or less the same because you are using those savings, right? And so maybe you've paid off your mortgage, you've paid off your car loans, and you have those retirement savings on which to live. So obviously, it's never as smooth as it is in this graph, but in the long run, people try to keep those changes in consumption pretty low. And so even if you lose your job, you're still going to eat, you're still going to pay your rent. You will make obviously some changes. You might not go to the movies, you might not go on vacation, but you're going to change it by less than your income goes down. So this is an important part of the macroeconomy because since consumer spending is 60 to 70% of GDP, then when consumer spending is smooth, that means that there's a certain amount of gross domestic product that will be smooth too. Remember that one person's spending is another person's income. On the other hand, there are going to be some limitations to consumption smoothing, right? Either people that are impatient, have some weakness of will, and so they don't save or they can't smooth consumption as well as they want. There could be credit constraints so that people are not able to borrow when they have some bad luck. There could be some limited amount of coinsurance, right, that isn't working. And so uh, that means that consumption will go down in a recession, right? It just won't go down by as much as income goes down. So, for instance, if we see some credit constrained households, then they can only consume what their income is, right? So when their income is low, their consumer spending will be low. When their income rises, their consumer spending will rise. On the other hand, if there are other households that are not credit constrained, they'll be much more able to smooth consumption. Credit constraints are important, but they're more important for some groups than for others. So, for instance, lower income households tend to be much more credit constrained than higher income households. And of course, they're also going to have lower wealth than the higher income households in general. And so that is going to affect their ability to smooth their consumption, during recessions. Weakness of will is another possibility. So in this case, it's a little bit different because now you have a higher income here and you don't reduce your consumption until your income falls. So there's an interesting paper that one of my advisors in graduate school wrote where he looked at household spending in a period where unions had an actual decrease in their income that was coming up in the future. And so they had negotiated this contract that said they would have a decrease in pay at some time in the future. And so a consumption smoothing household would realize that, okay, I need to save money now. I'm going to decrease my consumption. And then in the future, I will run down that savings. In actuality, what people did was they consumed at the steady level right until their income went down, and then they decreased their spending. So a lot of people have this weakness of will. They don't want to have the loss of feeling that they're consuming less than they used to be. And so that's another reason that households don't aren't always able to smooth their consumer spending. Investment, on the other hand, as we said, is much more volatile. So this is both growth rates in real GDP, that's the blue line, and then real gross private domestic investment, so on equipment, so that's one piece, and then residential fixed investment, which is building new houses. So obviously one of the issues with the last recession was that we had built a lot of extra houses sort of between 2000 and 2006. And so once we realized that we weren't going to need all these houses, construction basically fell off the roof, right? So to speak. And so both the green line and the red line, two different measures of investment, decreased by almost 30%, whereas GDP fell only about 3.5%. And so, and obviously, the reason that we can get away with this volatile investment is that we don't need to invest to survive, whereas we do need to consume to survive. And so this can be sort of either a virtuous cycle during expansions or a vicious cycle during recessions, where high demand means that we have high capacity utilization, meaning firms are producing almost as much as they can, and so they invest in more, and that leads to even higher demand because one person's spending is another person's income, and we end up with higher demand. But it can work in the opposite direction too, right? When we have low demand, which means we have low capacity utilization, firms could produce more, but they're just not selling it, so there's no reason to. That means they don't need to invest. That means we have even lower demand, and so this is sometimes called, the accelerator principle of investment, where if demand is low, firms aren't investing, and so GDP gets even lower, and vice versa. In expansions, demand is high, firms are investing more, and so demand becomes even higher. And in some ways, it's kind of a coordination game. So I won't go into this too much since we didn't cover games in chapter 4 in this class. But basically, a game is just when there are more players, and what I do affects your payoff, and what you do affects my payoff, right? And so here we have two players, A and B. And if they both invest, they both do well. If they both don't invest, they both do okay. But if one does not invest and the other does, then the one who does not invest did better, right? And so if they could get together and say, all right, well, let's both invest, then they'd end up here. But if they can't coordinate, then they end up in this not so good situation where they both don't invest. And so recessions are kind of like getting stuck down here when there's external information that's also telling firms not to invest, whereas expansions are more like up here where we're saying, all right, yeah, now demand is high, firms should invest, we all invest, and we all do well. Business confidence is one of those things that determines, sort of how much we invest. And so, it's just a measure based on a survey, which is in this green line, and you can see it looks very similar to the graph we looked at before, where business investment and confidence both sort of fell off a cliff and didn't recover until 2010, 2011. Even then, 2012, it wasn't so high as well. It's a little bit higher now. So if we think about investment and the aggregate economy, so we have these sort of self-reinforcing cycles where everybody wants to invest in expansions and nobody wants to invest during recessions. And that means that gross investment, both here in the UK and in the US, which is the orange line, is much more volatile than either consumption or total GDP. You can see consumption and GDP are usually pretty close in terms of their growth rates, but investment is really low during recessions and tends to be much higher during expansions. In terms of the other components of GDP, government spending tends to be less volatile, although that's more true for federal spending than for state and local government spending, because the federal government is able to borrow during a recession by selling bonds. And often during a recession, investors want to buy bonds because they feel it's a safe asset to invest in. And so the federal government can borrow, they can run a deficit, and they can increase spending during a recession, whereas state and local governments often don't have that opportunity. Many state governments have a balanced budget amendment in their constitution, and so cannot borrow and run a deficit during recession, which is a problem because tax revenue tends to fall during a recession, which means that spending also has to fall. So one of the things that the federal government did in 2009, 2010 was to borrow and then give that money to the state and local governments so that they could keep spending. Exports, on the other hand, depend on the business cycles of the other countries, right? So if we're exporting a lot to Canada and Mexico, then our exports are going to depend on whether or not Canada and Mexico are in a recession. And if there's a lot of trade linkages between countries, then often what happens is that a recession in one big country can get sort of exported to other countries because, hey, now we're not buying as many imports. Well, those imports are the exports of Canada, Mexico, Europe, China. And so that means that they're not producing as much. That can send them into recession as well.